is starting to quiet down, so it seems like passing the peace is officially over. Hopefully you had a chance to talk to a few friends nearby. My name's Charlie. I'm a Missio community leader here with Missio Mesa, and it's a joy to be sharing with you this morning. So it was Friday night, or Friday afternoon, I should say. My 3-year-old was just about to wake up from his nap, and scattered throughout our house are little clusters of games that are spilled on the floor, and crafts, and some homework or schoolwork for one of the kids. A lot of messes that Henry had made himself before he went to sleep. And as he woke up, our plan was, once he wakes up, we would rally the troops and we would go to Costco to celebrate dinner at Costco on a Friday night. Because you can feed a whole family at Costco for under $10. I don't know if you guys knew that. And so we're getting ready to go, and Henry wakes up, but then I realized it's a really important thing before we need to go. We need to clean the house. Like, if we wait to come back, the kids are going to be tired. They're not going to want to help. And so as an incentive to go to Costco and with the free samples, I say, guys, Clark and Cozy, guys, we just got to clean up for 20 minutes. 20 minutes, and then we'll go to Costco. And when Clark heard that C word, that horrible word, clean, literally this is what he said, "But Dad, it's the Sabbath." I was both proud and also at the same time a little frustrated because now his rigid practice of the Sabbath was preventing him from picking up a couple magnetiles on the ground. We get in the car. Finally, he does clean up. He'll be forgiven later for his Sabbath relaxing there. And so we get in the car. We go to Costco. And like Costco has that great consumerist model where you have to walk all the way to the back of the store to get the essentials. So you pass everything on the way. And you only came in for one item, but really you leave for about 20. That's kind of how it works. And so in the back of the store were some of the items we needed, like eggs, milk, and toilet paper. We get to the back of Costco, and there's an emergency. There's no toilet paper. Has anybody been to Costco the last couple of weeks and experienced this? They got some recently, so the problem's been fixed. But all I could think of, and I went to the back of the store, and there's no toilet paper, is someone on some Reddit forum or Facebook post has synthesized together that the war in the Middle East, the port strike happening in South Carolina, the hurricanes, and a presidential election all together means the world is coming to an end. So you better hoard your resources now. Get the toilet paper. And it's not as if like 4 years ago, America and the rest of the world had any traumatic event that they haven't processed, that the moment some things have gone wrong, they just immediately start grabbing stuff and hoarding for themselves. Even just this morning, I don't know about you, but I'm getting a text message, about 10 of them a day. Someone needs to help me, of different political ads. Some of them get me right away. Also in the mail, we get like 3 or 4 postcards a day. I was meaning to bring one this morning. One had there's like a door, and it's like you're like fearful as you look at like what's behind the door. And the postcard's trying to get you to open the door, and then bam, it hits you with what's ever wrong and who you should vote for and what's wrong with the world. I share all this is because maybe, behind Clark's groaning about cleaning, but really his groaning for the Sabbath, may be buried deep within us, deeper than just, I want to get away from cleaning, is a desire for rest, for peace in the midst of anxiety. That the Sabbath practice in a culture of hoarding, greed, anxiety, panic, restlessness is one of the primary ways you and me, as the people of God, embrace our missionary identity in the city. That as you practice a period of rest every week in some form or way, it actually showcases to the watching world a people that do things another way. The invitation this morning as we continue our series through the blessed rhythms that Kevin started last week is to look at that last rhythm, Sabbath, and to explore together how the Sabbath isn't just a good idea, a good rhythm to have like the other ones. They aren't just things that make you a healthy person, but these rhythms are actually counterforming you. They're like rhythms of resistance to the dominant stories and gods of our culture and our day. They're actually forming us to be a people and to have a life that we've always wanted. Like the life that you long for, that I long for, the life that we want of abundance and unbelievable joy and delight and generosity, that comes through these everyday practices of bless, listen, eat, speak, and Sabbath. And as we put them together over a long period of time, my hunch, because these are the rhythms of the kingdom, is we will have that abundant life that we long for. And the Sabbath is crucial to that life that God wants us to live into. So today we're going to look at a story in the Gospel of Matthew, and we're going to see how Jesus responds to some Pharisees around the practice of the Sabbath. So if you have a Bible, I'd love for you to open it. Turn to Matthew chapter 12. I'm going to read it. You can read it in front of you, or I also have it on the screen here. I'm going to read through the story, and then I'm going to ask you a simple question that you're going to dialogue with some people around you. The simple question is this: what do we learn about the Sabbath from this story? What does Jesus want us to see, to learn about his understanding of the Sabbath? This practice of and rhythm of rest that was built into the way that God's people were to live. What does he want us to learn? Because he's going to have an encounter here with the religious leaders of his time, and he's going to challenge the way they think about the Sabbath. And I think, hopefully, challenge us as well. So here it is on the screen, Matthew 12, 1 through 14. Let me read this. You can follow along in the Bible in front of you, or you can look at the screen, and then I'll break you into groups to discuss. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath." He answered, "Haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry?" Pause. If some of your Bibles have like a cross-reference, you could look that story up. It's in the Old Testament. Verse 4, he entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priest. Or haven't you read in the law that the priest on Sabbath duty in the temple desecrate the Sabbath and yet are innocent? I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. And if you had known what these words mean, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Going on from that place, he went into their synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Looking for a reason to bring charges against Jesus, they asked him, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" He said to them, "If any of you has a sheep, and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Therefore, it's lawful to do good on the Sabbath." And then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And so he stretched it out, and it was completely restored, just as sound as the other. And this is how the story ends. But the Pharisees went out and plotted how they might kill Jesus. All right, so turn to the people around you. Just from these two stories put together, verses 1 through 14, what do you think Jesus is wanting us to learn or rediscover about the Sabbath? All right, turn to people around you, and then I'll have a time of sharing together. All right, let me call you back. I'd love to hear from a couple different people. I'll bring the mic to you. I would love to hear, what do you think Jesus is trying to teach us, to show us, to reshape us when it comes to the Sabbath from this story?
We felt that in a lot of ways Jesus was saying that it doesn't matter so much what you do or don't do on the Sabbath, but rather why you do those things and your mind and intentions behind those.
Awesome.
We talked about it's really easy to potentially overcomplicate the thought of what Sabbath should be, and instead of trying to fit all of the what can I do, what can't I do, or think of it as we just need to stop doing all things, there seems to be a restorative nature to it. So anything that is bringing about a sense of someone being able to rest would include the heart of the Sabbath.
In fairness to my group, I'm the only one who said this, but just from this story alone, one might conclude that the Sabbath is obsolete, because one might interpret it as Jesus saying, why are you guys worried about the Sabbath? I assume that's not the case because we're teaching about it, but
That's great.
With that, I was thinking when in verse 9 or 8, verse 8, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, that stood out to me, of like Jesus embodying and fulfilling the law as the way he was showing how it like could be done.
Absolutely. Any more before we jump?
Yeah. I'll fill up Charlie's time. He's usually pretty quick to speak. I think verse 7 is the most impactful to me. If you had known what these words mean, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, the callback to Hosea, you would not have condemned the innocent. There's something that I think Jesus does here where he is kind of and I think it's what causes the Pharisees to want to plot to kill Jesus. He's taking the Pharisees that are asking the question, is it lawful to heal? And he's lumping them back into the misunderstanding of all of the prophets of, before Hosea and on. And so I think there's like a real beauty that he's saying Sabbath shouldn't be attached to condemnation if somebody is not doing it the correct way. And I think that goes for all of the law. And he says it right before, somebody greater than the law is here.
Each week when we get a chance to do this kind of work where we share with one another, we really do believe as a church that the Spirit of God's not working through the person just that stands on the stage or the person that sings, but that through the community reading the Bible together, we actually get to hear from God. So maybe as people just shared, I'm going to try to tie some things together in my own study and work on this, but also as people shared, maybe one of those things is going to resonate with you and begin like a little mustard seed to grow in your heart and have you reconsider what the Sabbath is for and what it's like. And to be really honest, as we transition into the next part of the sermon, I was tempted all week because there's so many great resources on the Sabbath out there. I think this is probably the most over-resourced thing, at least in the West, over-resourced area of the church. Like people, there's great courses you can take online. There's great books you can read. There's great tools that have been developed. There's so much out there. And I was tempted in many ways just to regurgitate the best practices of what's out there. But I think, faithfully, I think it would miss the point of what Jesus is trying to do here. That Jesus here in this story, if we're going to be faithful to what he's saying in Matthew 12, is not necessarily concerned about giving you the best practices for the Sabbath, but giving you intentional shifts to make in how you engage with the blessed rhythm of Sabbath. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. We're going to look at 2 intentional shifts that Jesus makes here for our understanding of the Sabbath, and then it will give us a chance to work it out as we think about the rest of our lives. The first shift is this, and I think Cole kind of captured it. The first shift is Jesus is less concerned about particular practices and more about the Sabbath being about a person. A person. It's not the practices, but it's the person, the Lord of the Sabbath, the one greater than the temple that is here. But more than that, the Sabbath is not a retreat, but actually a reorientation of our affections and our allegiances. Jesus is inviting the Pharisees and you and me listening into the story to focus less on how or what, and as Cole said, but the why. Like the purpose of the Sabbath, if he's the Lord of the Sabbath, is it's about a person. It's about orienting ourselves towards Jesus. And the only thing that separates the Sabbath, the biblical practice, from kind of spiritual wellness or some other kind of form of retreat is that in many ways we center on ourselves and our own peace of mind, but rather Jesus is inviting us to come to him, the person, the Lord of the Sabbath. Now, one practical way I think that shows up in how we gather or how we live as a church is this gathering right here. Like one of the ways that we reorient our affections and our allegiances is through the practice of gathering every week as the people of God. There's something that happens to us over a long period of time of just showing up every week, showing up every Sabbath to sing, to listen, to learn and share with one another, to take communion. Now, here's the deal. 50 years from now, you probably might not remember more than a handful of sermons or a handful of moments that happened in this room, let's say. You just won't, unless you're Isaiah and me, who loves to listen to sermons a lot. Other than that, you just probably won't remember. You won't. But something happened to you over those 50 years. It was a slow drip of formation. It wasn't an instant pot. It was a slow cooker. And over those 50 years, song, sermon, and sacrament form you at the deepest part of your being. They awaken your affections and your allegiances. You show up every Sunday as a return, as, hey, my allegiance is to Jesus and his kingdom. And the act of showing up reforms my heart and my mind, and hopefully then my hand sent into the city. So I just want to encourage you, even that you're here today, that this is actually part of the Sabbath practice that Jesus is trying to get us around, not the particular things happening, but the fact that we're gathering because of one person, Jesus. And this week, if you feel and you sense in your own heart a sense of wanting to escape these gatherings, like you need to find rest elsewhere, just be curious about that. Like, what is it about in our own hearts if we feel like the gathering isn't a place where we actually find rest, we actually find encounter with God? Like, be curious about why that is and why we have to find rest elsewhere and we can't find it here with Jesus. So that's the first shift. The second shift, let me tell you about through a story. So a couple of weeks ago, I was looking through the Church Center app for our MC, and somebody posted, who happens to be serving kids today. This maybe is good or bad, depending on the context. They're serving kids, but they're great. They posted in the Church Center app that they're planning on moving. They're moving from an apartment to a house. It's great. This is wonderful news. Like, this is awesome. They've been waiting for this house for a long time. And then I saw, hey, we would love help with the move on Sunday afternoon. Now, it was the Vissers that were moving. They're wonderful. I have some baggage from previous moves in my own life and other people's lives. I've done a lot of moving with people over the last couple of years, not part of this community, that have a lot of stuff. But we're talking about Megan Visser, all right? Do you guys know Megan? She's organized. I knew that we would not show up and it would be unprepared. She'd be ready to go. So anyways, I'm still kind of hesitant. And to quote Clark, like, but Scott, it's the Sabbath. Scott, I mean, come on, man. But I show up. I relent. My rigidity in my Sabbath practice goes aside. I show up, and you know what I find? I find 4 people that I'm blown away are there. There's a ton of people there. The Tipkes and Michaela. Now, here's why. The Tipkes live at the top of the 101. The Visser's apartment is in Tempe. They just drove 30 miles to be there. That's amazing. But Michaela, actually, she lives in California, basically. Like, she literally lives at the edge of the world of Phoenix. And she drove 45 to an hour to get there, to serve her friends on her Sabbath, to care for people that she deeply loves. And I was so encouraged and also ashamed a bit, as I live literally 3 minutes from the visitor's house. But I'm there, and I see this picture of all these people on their Sunday afternoon. As part of many of them, their Sabbath rhythm are serving their good friends and finding joy in the midst of carrying a lot of boxes up and down stairs, enjoying some Domino's pizza, moving the stuff into the new place and celebrating that God had provided a new place for the visitors to live. Like, so good. And here's the second shift that I think Jesus is showcasing us in that second part of the story, that the Sabbath and service are not enemies, but they're friends. They're friends. Jesus comes on the Sabbath and he sees a man that's wounded, a shriveled hand. And it's sad because the Pharisees have become so stuck behind their rigidity and their rules that they miss a man that's standing before Jesus that can't even work. Think of a culture where your hands were so valuable. Not just in our culture now where you type on a computer for most jobs, but like manual labor. He could not participate. And instead of seeing the man, they've tried to focus on a way to catch Jesus And Jesus says it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath, that service and Sabbath are not enemies, they are friends, and for us to consider as a people that our Sabbath rhythms both have times where we rest and take naps and take care of our bodies, but also moments where we can find Sabbath rest in the midst of service, like helping friends move from one place to another. Jesus is trying to give us a full vision of the Sabbath that is both, yes, rest for your souls in the things that often where we need to retreat, but also rest for your souls in the act of serving neighbor and friend. He's trying to hold the two things together. So for some of us, when we think about our practices of Sabbath, we need to get better at saying no. Like, no, I'm not going to participate in that. That's some of us. But I'd also argue some of us need to get better at saying yes. Yes, I want to actually participate in the Sabbath work of with neighbor and friend and in God's creation because something happens there too, and it's lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Here's a simple definition for you of what the Sabbath is. The Sabbath is a weekly reorientation of our affections and allegiance to Jesus. It's a time and space to enjoy God, creation, and neighbor. And I think the invitation for us in this passage, in those two shifts, to focus on the practices but the person, but to see Sabbath and service not as enemies and friends, gives us a really wide field to practice the Sabbath. Like so much freedom and abundance to choose what actually is restful and meaningful, what parts of creation you really enjoy, what parts are just absolutely not restful for you, but also an invitation to see service as part of those rhythms too, in some form or way. I'm going to give you a challenge, as Kevin gave you a challenge last week around the Sabbath, and the challenge is, I would love for you this week to share a story of a Sabbath moment where you delighted in God, creation, or neighbor. Some of you are going to love this, some of you are going to be like, I'm going to actually create on the Prayer and Stories Church Center app in Missio Mesa, I'm going to create a thread, and I would love for you to either to post a picture or to create a description of some moment this week where you had an experience with God, creation, or neighbor. And you don't need to wait till the weekend, because as if like the Sabbath's coming, because we're actually the Sabbath people of God now, that we've entered into God's rest. And so we get to not just have moments of Sabbath, but a Sabbath mood, that our whole lives are shaped by the Sabbath, that we can walk in rest and freedom and abundance. And so this week, I'd love for you, just as we blessed last week, someone and 3 people in thought, word, or deed, I'd love for you this week to share with your family small ways that the Sabbath took residence in your life. Maybe in unexpected ways, maybe even in an act of service where you saw a little glimpse of how God designed the world to be. When you think about this challenge, please do not think spectacular but simple. Like simple, as Kevin said, mundane, mustard seed type practices, habits. But there's something that's kind of haunted me with this passage and this story all week is that last verse, verse 14. That after these 2 encounters, the Pharisees, those who knew the law, that were the most rigid and faithful in many ways, that people would see, to God, had these encounters with Jesus around the Sabbath, and they looked to murder him. They plotted to kill him. That's haunting, right? Like you can miss it. Like you can be blind. You can not see clearly. The question I've been wrestling with is why? Why is that? Like what happened to the Pharisees? And how do we not fall into the same trap around even the practice of Sabbath? That's become very popularized in our culture and within the church in really good ways. But like how do we not miss the point of it? And I think that the answer is simple. The Pharisees had found themselves in a different story. They had not understood the Sabbath and the context of the story from creation to restoration. So to lead us to the table this morning, to experience rest with Jesus, I want to just rehearse for you the story that the Sabbath finds its place in and the invitation that Jesus has for you this morning. So for 400 years, God's people were slaves. They had come under the power of a god named Pharaoh. Ruthless, no rest, savage in many ways as far as how they treated the Israelites. Horrible. They cry out to God. God hears them, he sends Moses, and he delivers them miraculously from their slavery. He defeats Pharaoh, the god. He liberates his people, leads them across the Red Sea and into the wilderness. But 400 years of slavery in one place, under one story, under a different God, will form and shape you to the deepest part of your being. And so what Israel needed, God's people in the wilderness, at the mountain, was to be re-narrated, to be reformed. And so Moses and his leaders, around campfires and tents at the base of a mountain, begin to retell the story of who they were, their identity. It's the story of Genesis. In this story, the Israelites, humans in general, were not slaves or slave labor for the gods, but they were image bearers, icons of God, sent out into all the world to showcase God's glory and beauty. In this story, humans were to partner with God in this rhythm of work and rest, just as God created the world. 6 days of work, 1 day of rest. Humans are now invited to pattern their lives like the life of God. In this story, the 10 ways to live, known as the commandments, were entirely bridged and hinged on the practice of the Sabbath, a 24-hour period of time where they paused, they delighted in God, they received his abundance and his joy and the things that he offered them. That the first 3 commandments were to love God, and the last 6 were to love neighbor. And the Sabbath, the practice of it, was to hold it all together. But not only 1 day a week, but they were to, every 7 years, let the land lie fallow and not grow crops, because God would provide abundantly for them the year before. And every 50 years, they were to reconcile and redeem and restore all that was broken. And the Sabbath wasn't just for the elite or those who had economic realities that would benefit them, but the Sabbath was for all. Even the poorest of poor was able to celebrate in God's story. But instead of being formed in that story, Israel, as they were around the surrounding nations and supposed to be a light, and the Sabbath was supposed to be the way that they would be a distinct people in the context of the world, to show a new way to be human, they were allured by the other stories once again, just like in Egypt. They were sent into exile. They had broken the Sabbath command along with all the other ones. And again, for 400 years, they cried out, God, give us rest from our enemies, from the tyranny of those who rule over us. And Jesus comes on the scene. The most simple and not spectacular of births, lives the most ordinary of life the first 30 years, just the faithful rhythms of work and rest. And through Jesus' life, ultimately his death and resurrection, he brought an end to the exhaustion that sin brings on the world. Sin is exhausting, am I right? The way it changes you and it changes me and it breaks God's world, it leaves a world that is not only groaning, but is exhausted. He comes to defeat it, to liberate us from the power and tyranny of sin, to offer us, it says in Hebrews, rest that we've always longed for, that now we can enter in. And it's interesting, as we look forward to the end of the story and we embody the Sabbath rest of Jesus now as the church, and our practices are not to get in the way of the worship of the person of Jesus, but to aid that part of our formation. It's interesting that right before this passage, which is where our service started today, would you turn there? Matthew 11, verse 28. Right before Jesus gives this picture here to the Pharisees, he says these words. He says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. The invitation this morning is for you to respond to those words of Jesus, come to me. And the way you do that right now is what we do every single week. You're going to stand from your seat, and you're going to come to the table, and you're going to receive from Jesus, who offers you the rest that your heart has always longed for, but not just for you, but for creation and for your neighbor. And as you come to the table this morning to take the bread and the juice, my reminder, encouragement for you is this is a way to reenact your allegiance this morning to Jesus as King. That as you come forward, you are saying with your whole body and then with your taste, Jesus, you are King. And in you I find the rest my heart so desperately wants. And then as you go from the table into this week, you're invited to experiment, to practice, to form habits around what a Sabbath rhythm might look like in your life. But it starts with Jesus as the Lord of the Sabbath, that He's the one that's invited you, come to me and find rest.